Janine, you want to call a roll?
Just as a reminder to all who are in attendance, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the county's YouTube page. Calling the roll, Judge Adrian.
Here.
Ms. Yarham.
Here.
Ms. Gibbons.
Here.
Mr. Cross is absent at the moment. Judge McClellan is absent at the moment. There is a quorum.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're going to try to expedite this. We have a lot that we need to cover and not a whole lot of time to get it done. So we'll work on it. Are there any public comments this morning? Janine?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Nikita Stange.
Thank you. Good morning.
Oh, sorry. Good morning. I'm Nikita Stang from CASA of Cuyahoga County. We've been here before to present to you regarding the work that we do with children in foster care within the county. We just want to remind the committee the important advocacy work that our volunteers do and the difference that it makes in the lives of some of our most vulnerable children. So I want to thank you for your time and dedication that you've put towards this committee, and we look forward to reading the final report. Thank you.
Thank you. Janine?
No one else is signed in.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving right along. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from March the 20th?
So moved.
Second?
Yes.
Probably moved and seconded. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
That would make it unanimous there. Okay. Small group. Okay. Is there any old business that we need to take care of? Okay, hearing none, moving on to new business. We have a number of items that we want to try to address this morning. It's going to be a dash for the border. Okay. Can we review the combined subcommittees meeting summaries? Everybody, I want to thank you for submitting those to us so we have them available for the final report. Have you had an opportunity to take a look at them? Okay. Are there any amendments, additions, corrections, deletions that need to be made at this time?
Of the overall report, I think this is going to be a work in progress for a little bit. I think we need to really get a little bit more on brevity for people who are going to actually want to read the full thing. So I think that there's, between now and the next, we can work on just refining the language between every summary, things of that nature, and consolidate some of the duplicative overlapping recommendations. I thought today we could kind of look at some of the recommendations, see where there's consistent themes, start to prioritize those.
Yeah, the summaries are what they are. You know, I think that everybody did a great job in trying to reduce them down to the essence of what took place during the course of those meetings. And people will have the opportunity, it's my understanding, to visit the website and see the full thing. And if they just want to get the quick and dirty, they can take a look at the summaries that we've put together. So I think we're in good shape. Hearing no other further comment, let's move on to the next piece, which would be to review the combined subcommittee recommendations. Jennifer and Bridget, I have made my best effort to try to go through and cull out from all of the things that were put in front of us, the things that looked like they were recommendations, and we forwarded them to you. Couldn't get them to you any faster than we did, unfortunately. So I know you haven't had a lot of time to take a look at them, but off the top, before we kind of try to do any type of a deep dive, anything specifically either that you think should be added or eliminated?
I just think there's a lot here, and so if we could consolidate things into sort of categories, I think it would probably help us focus our efforts a little bit more.
Yeah, there were just under 100 recommendations that we pulled together from what was there. I tried to go through and to break them down to both actionable and emotionary kind of considerations, but I'm not sure that I did a complete job on that. So today would be a good time for us to take a look and see whether or not there's more that can be done. We also tried to categorize, at least I tried to categorize things according to what I thought was the best grouping. So the first things that are in the report all have to do with things fiscal. Okay, so there's a lot there. I don't know how you'd like to tackle it.
Well, and correct me if I'm off here, one of the things I was thinking is it might be helpful for us to pull out what is funded by like DYS or Reclaim versus what we specifically in the county would be seeking funding for, because while we might recommend to continue some of those programs, it wouldn't really direct our funding recommendations locally, but it would help us, you know, advocacy-wise at the state.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, or am I?
No. You know, I think funding-wise, any recommendations that came from me or the judges is based on things that are not covered by current funding avenues, such as Reclaim. So, you know, although Reclaim, you know, I think we're anticipating in the next fiscal year a pretty significant drop in Reclaim. Reasons being are good things. So we've been really increasing capacity. We increased many of our programs. In the last few calendar years, we have trimmed the fat on things where we were over allocated. So those are good reasons that we're going to see, because we had some, when COVID hit, we had very few, we had an influx of money because of a reduction in DYS commitments. And so we had carryover for many, many years that we were really struggling to get allocated to programming. But since then, in the last 2 fiscal years, we have funded 20 of our grassroots agencies to work very closely with young children. And those have really, really been important, vital programming for kids. But it's also reduced our carryover. So I think that, you know, any recommendations that are coming from me are going to be things that are not covered by state funds or other federal grants, things of that nature. So I think that's where, you know, we kind of talked about right now we're funded for some things. I had talked about the need for, and I think this was a common theme across this, when COVID hit, alternatives to detention, respite, trauma-informed placements in lieu of detention really took a pretty significant hit. The other place that, you know, we cannot use state funding for are residential placements, so trauma-informed residential placements. We can't use Reclaim funding for those with the exception of very specific evidence-based treatment programs that we have with our CBTC program. And I'm not drawing to the top of my head, but there's, you know, Care First Cuyahoga, which is what we are beginning to plan for diversion of young kids, specifically young Black children, away from the youth justice system. That is a planning grant. So we're doing resource mapping, gap analysis, things of that nature. And when we complete that work, we're going to have recommendations to the county, you know, so right now we don't have a dollar amount to that, but we'll be looking for support for whatever comes of that, because that's really talking about prevention efforts. You know, I think one of the themes that's come up a lot here is, you know, trying to address kids that are deep, deep in and don't have a lot of protective factors, things of that nature. So we should really be thinking about how do we catch those young people way further upstream, try to divert them away from the youth justice system, support their families in ways that are meaningful, sustaining, and that they're not going to end up continuing to come through the youth justice system. So those are some things. The other places, there are specialized probation officers that we can put on the reclaim plan, but they have to be matched with an evidence-based program. And it really, reclaim is designed for programs to divert kids away from the youth justice system or serve them effectively if they come into contact with the youth justice system. So our probation officers are carrying significantly higher caseload sizes than what is recommended through the NEKC's probation transformation. We know that we're probably never going to get to the place where we have a caseload of 12 to 15 kids. We know that. But if we could get further into the ballpark of 18, 20 kids per PO, just a quick reminder of the types of things that our probation officers and diversion specialists shared with us is these are high-need young people. They don't have a lot of, protective factors. They're coming from communities where, there's a drainage of resources. They have historically been marginalized communities. So, putting in protective factors is what our probation officers are working with, some complex trauma with these young people, availability, ease of access to guns, carrying guns for protection, trying to help those young people get tapped into their potential requires a lot more than a monthly check-in with your PO. It requires working with the family. It requires meeting kids in their communities and really doing case management, coaching type model of delivery of court supervision versus the old school sanction-based type supervision where they're rarely checking in with their POs and we're only punishing certain violations of probation versus getting to the unmet needs of those young people. So, one of my recommendations are things that cannot be supported through reclaim, improving or increasing funding for probation officers so that we can do effective community supervision with well-trained probation officers to work with high-need, high-risk young people. And I know our judges send in their recommendations. We can kind of talk about those, but for now, I will pass this over to the rest of the committee to kind of talk about their recommendations.
Thank you. The record should reflect that committee member, subcommittee member Marvin Cross has joined us. Hey, Marvin, how you doing this morning? I was thinking, as I looked at the judge's recommendation, that a lot of the recommendations that we've seen are supportive of the recommendations that have been made by the court, and there should be a lot of fold in, sort of by way of support of those recommendations by the rest of the community, because it makes all kinds of sense for us to do that. My focus in the entire period of time that I've been practicing law, but certainly during the time that I was on the bench, has always been prevention. And prevention is the hardest thing to get funded because it's hard to prove a negative. And so the whole process of trying to get to the point where you can get people to put money into something that is really difficult to measure is very hard, but that's really where we get the biggest benefit, at least in my view, for the money that we spend. Even if you can't measure it, it's counterintuitive that you wouldn't get more keeping people out of the system as a whole. So anything that we get from that perspective is anything that we recommend from that perspective, I think is beneficial. And looking over the judge's recommendations, I recognize that we gave them the charge of coming up with a wish list. And so when I look at the dollar amounts that would really be necessary for the court to be able to do all the things that it wants to do, clearly that's the county's not going to do that. Sad to say. But I think that our task really is to identify the things that are on that wish list that are eminently doable by the county, and give them the entire wish list just in case they want to do something more than what we think they are prepared to do. You know, that's a possibility. So I agree with you that that's the direction that we ought to go into, because a lot of the things that are on our recommendation list from the community really dovetail with the things that are on the judge's wish list. So that's going to be, I think, the major task ahead, is to try to see what things can we put in those boxes. Marvin, did you get a chance to take a look at the judge's list? Yeah. And also the recommendations that we sent out before? Yes, I got a chance. Okay. Jennifer, no.
Got a lot to go through. No, I would agree with you. I think, you could kind of, as we categorize things, look at like the prevention, early intervention box, right? Because we do have those outcomes to help show, at least on the early intervention and diversion center, that kids that are coming through at the front end, we're preventing them from deeper end continuum. I just think we need to look at the best way to organize, like, what are our recommendations? Is it early intervention prevention, reentry, kids that are currently in detention, or kids that are in out-of-home placement, and make recommendations there? Or is it overall, here are our top priorities?
So, and I'm just going to kind of look, just a couple things as far as funding, where the judges talked about was really greater coordination services between, youth serving systems. We heard a lot from our, from folks that were presenters or provided public comment about young people who come into the youth justice system have significant child welfare involvement, have significant trauma, families struggling with poverty. So, the recommendation number 3 from the judges about greater coordination and services between systems and supporting Care First Cuyahoga, while that's, whatever comes out of that planning period, that we support that, I think that will help not just the youth justice system, but it'll greatly reduce financial burdens on the child welfare system if we're helping families in need and diverting kids away from the youth justice system and reducing trauma in that way. It helps kids in the educational system. I think it's going to be a much more streamlined use of county resources between all the child serving systems. Jen has been a longtime service, service provider and involved in planning for decades around youth serving systems and how Adams Board, the Board of Developmental Disabilities, Juvenile Court, Child Welfare all work together on these cases. When you think about waiting till a family is in crisis to start serving them with deep end services, if we had identified them earlier upstream and those kids don't come into the youth justice system, that is much better financial sense for our county in the long run, when we're just getting, maybe it's basic need issues, maybe it's just a support for caregivers, maybe, it's, parental mental health. We identify those when there's flags and concerns instead of waiting until a family's in a crisis and a kid is at risk of being placed out of the home. Residential beds in Cuyahoga County are significantly expensive. They're very costly. So doing the work upstream, I think, is cost savings for our county as a whole. So whatever we come out of OJJDP, the judges, I know I put that in as my recommendation. I think that should be prioritized. The other piece that I think we have come a long way in, and that is thanks to the researchers, and it is thanks to our other youth serving entities, is a significant reduction in placing kids in secured congregate care settings, whether it's the detention center or residential beds. We have come a long way in only reserving those for kids that really need that level of involvement, but, COVID really kind of had a lasting impact on therapeutic, safe spaces for young people that they don't belong in our detention center. They don't belong over in the Jane N. Hunter building. We don't need them at the level of a crisis bed, but we need a safe space for them so that the service coordination people can get together and come up with a longer, cost-effective and therapeutically effective program. And I know the judges mentioned, an alternative to detention continuum, whether it's respite homes, trauma-informed group homes, dedicated, appropriate residential beds. When a youth rises to that level in lieu of like our detention center or the Jane N. Hunter floor, I know the centers and everyone's doing a lot of work around that. We've had contracts for this. It's still a place where we struggle to fund it. We struggle to have capacity for it. So I think that's an important one. We talked about we take seriously the decisions if a child is removed from the home. We coach people all the time to say that is not something that we should be doing if they don't rise to that level. But I think when we do it, a lot of times young people in our county are going very far away from home. Families are not able to get to them. So those are just some things that I think could help. The other thing that came up a lot is around guns. And, we know that right now, things like restorative justice, credible messengers, the court has pursued many grants that we can right now to fund those through the state, through competitive reclaim. We were awarded some funding for credible messengers, and we were awarded some funding for restorative justice. But that is like pilot level funding, sustaining effective support for restorative justice and credible messengers, I think would be really important. More of a healing-centered approach versus more punitive, sanction-driven approaches, I think will help young people and families and our community as a whole.
Well, I think, frankly, my biggest concern is that at a point in time when we really need to have greater funding, that we're going to see less funding coming from places that have been giving money at a high rate. Our biggest conundrum is that some of the people who need the most by way of services are also some of the people who have committed the most heinous crimes. So if you got people who are charged with really significant violent acts, but they're still kids, you got to figure out a way to parse the difference between getting them what they need and the community's perception as it relates to how safe it is to have them in something other than a secured lockdown. And so I'm interested in hearing from you about how do we bridge that divide.
So honestly, I think when we look back at everything that was presented over the last few months, it's been more than a few months. But we're talking about nothing unique to Cleveland, right? But it might be at a higher level in Cleveland than other communities, and we might be rebounding differently than other communities across the country. So I know there's been a lot of talk about, young people are more violent, this, that, and the other. But I think there's some contributing factors that we know, accessibility, availability, the ease of getting a gun. That's a big issue. And why do young people carry guns? I know Patrick McCarthy talked a lot about, the need to protect. So the fear of safety, things of that nature. But, they're still adolescents with impulsive adolescent brains that, aren't necessarily sitting down and weighing a cost benefit versus retaliation. They're generally going with, impulsive thinking. So I think, we have to do the things that work for kids that are in communities that are resource rich, right? So thinking about, this from sort of a larger, we can't be reactionary to everything all the time. While it might feel good in the moment, a sanction, locking a kid up and sending them away, far away from home, doesn't necessarily equate to long-term community safety. So if we're really looking at prevention, we have got to get these kids into things that I look at for my own kids, you know, track meets, you know, baseball, things that we can do to help young people have safe, appropriate mentors in their life, you know, prevention. If their families are having basic need issues, how do we help them with that? And I think taking a broader county-wide approach to looking at those highest impacted communities of gun violence and thinking about what are the needs of those communities, what are the needs of those young people, and how do we help it? You know, how do we help them? And I know we're not going to fix all of societal issues with the youth, with this committee. But when we think about the young people that come into contact with our youth justice system, if we look at the data and follow the data to the communities that are most harmed by gun violence, and we think about how do we help bring services into those young people and meet them where they're at and utilize the resources that are there that are natural to their environment, like mentors within the community, and support those, I think those can go a long way. I also think getting kids involved in activities, having mentors that can help kids think through their high-risk behaviors is going to go a lot further than reacting and locking kids up after they've done something. And it is hard to measure the things that don't happen. But I think after COVID, we're beginning to see the city of Cleveland has had a reduction in violence by like 30% reduction in homicides. I think that's important to highlight, that we're not in another era of we can't fix this, we can't turn this, we can't reduce this. I think that we can by doing the things that we know work. And I know when Patrick McCarthy really talked about credible messengers, mentoring and supports services help young people. Our probation officer shared a ton of success stories that they've had by helping the family system, our mental, you know, our clinicians that go out. You know, right now, it's difficult to recruit clinicians that are willing to do it in the home and in the communities that they're serving. When I was a therapist, we didn't have Zoom-based therapy. That was not even a thought. I would have laughed my head off if I would have heard that. Good luck, you know. But that's where a lot of graduate students are coming and wanting to sit in their jammies and do telehealth. But the kind of people that we need are those that are going to go into homes after parents get off of a long shift, sit with them and work with them in their homes, you know. So I know we talked about incentives for recruitment of clinicians. Those people make a difference with young people. We've seen it in the data. So I think we've really got to look at, you know, how to support those efforts that are working.
I think when we see success, right, it's people that are coming to you or helping you get to a safe space. So we've talked about people that are going out to the homes, going out to the schools, going out to the community in terms of professional workforce. But the other barrier that we have for a lot of our kids and their success is like the safe transportation to get to the rec center, the program, the after-school program, to get the parents to the court hearing. And so I do think that's a place where maybe we could help improve engagement and get kids access to out of school time or get families access to services really by looking at the transportation barrier for this community.
Marvin.
First, I want to thank our other committee members that did a lot of work on this. You guys put some real good work in it. I keep hearing about and we spoke about this, about our organizations. The different organizations that are out here that everybody is working toward getting it. We spoke about some of these organizations getting together, and you see funding is being cut all over. We were already trying to get funds. You see funds getting cut. So I was talking to the group CASA, and I hooked them up with, I don't know what happened out of it because I've been so busy, but I hooked them up with the city of Cleveland to try to see could they work out a collaborative together, because they have some resources. So if we put people together, but then I read in the paper they cutting CASA's funding. So I'm like, well, that's not going to help us any. So we're going to have to get some other groups that's going to have to try to pool together. And I mean, I hear you speak about these different activities. We spoke about this before. When I grew up, we had PAL, WISE, after-school programs. They don't have this. So the kids got nowhere to go, so where they gonna go? To the street? So we got all these rec centers all over the city. Even if they develop some programs, you got, okay, I know we talking about transportation programs, but if you live near where you could rec center have some rooms that you might be able to, I'm not saying it could be done, but it's at least it's a shot in the dark that you have the facilities there. You don't have to go and try to spend the money for it. People just got to work together. So I am going to reach back out to who I talked to in Casa. Even though I know they're going through their own issues now, but I think that that's going to help us out a lot with limited resources. When you have limited resources, you have to learn to work together. So it's just, I don't know. It's just funding. That's how we going to get the funding. I know the judge got a lot of money, so he could probably donate some funding, but you know.
Yeah, let me check with petty cash. I think that we need to go back and revisit what both Bridget and Jennifer were saying as it relates to how we organize this. Because for me, it falls into a couple of primary buckets. One is cash, a specific amount of cash that we think not only appropriate, but is also doable. So that whatever we send isn't so overwhelming to the council that they throw up their hands and say, well, we just can't do that. And the second has to do with the whole process of organizing community around some of these things to support what we come up with. This piece that would see fewer Black males actually going into carceral settings is something that I guess goes on the high road, and it's not necessarily something that we fund, but something that the community can get around in order to try to make that happen. I think it's important for us to figure out, as a matter of funding priority, actually, how much money actually needs to go into the planning side. So I think that the judges had requested funds for the purpose of doing about a year-long planning cycle. And sometimes people think, well, it's just the committee suggesting that we do more study. But given the nature of what we had by way of resources to actually do the deep dive that needs to be done as to how we coordinate people, there is going to be some additional study that has to be done. I think that our point is going to have to be to try to identify where we think that planning ought to be and who needs to be at the table.
I think there's a lot of groups that are working kind of in silos. So someone to help do like resource mapping or coordinating all the services that are out there. How are they funded? How do families get access? A combination of like the Adams Board has the directory, 211 has the directory. Like everybody doesn't always know what's available, how to access it, where it is in town, how it's funded. So some type of resource mapping that really coordinates what's available for youth in this community by neighborhood or by location would be really helpful.
And honestly, that's stuff that we're beginning to start dipping our toe into with OJJDP, continuum of care funding through Care First Cuyahoga. So that resource mapping, gap analysis, targeting, what is, there's many system partners that don't talk to each other effectively, only when we're families in crisis about to pull their hair out, and their kids about to be taken from the home. Really thinking about moving that way further up and looking at that. So I feel like that is something that we are embarking on with Care First Cuyahoga, and all the child-serving agencies have already agreed to take part in that and participate in that. I think the key is going to be whatever recommendation we come of we have to be able to support it from a countywide perspective versus expecting, one of those child-serving agencies to hold the burden of that when it's really benefiting the whole county. So I think that is, to Jen's point, a vital part of cross-system collaboration, prevention. Kids end up in the youth justice system out of other youth serving systems oftentimes, and helping staff to understand the telling parents to call the police when children are fighting one another isn't necessarily the right answer. That's not an answer that's going to equate to safety for the home, the family, or the community. I know that I'm just going through much of this. When we look at so many of the themes, the things that pop up to me, it's really about, we've got to look at the, trauma, the underlying needs, the better system coordination. I think we look at child welfare involvement at an early age as a huge predictor for future juvenile justice involvement. I know our judges spoke to that piece in their recommendations. I have to say, I think that's really important. And I know the team at Division of Children and Family Services is engaged with us in many ways, but I think support from the county for a county-wide better system coordination would be really important to look at. How do we help families when it's a 4th grader versus waiting till it's a 10th grader? How do we help them get their needs met at an earlier point? I know when some of us went out to Hennepin County, there was a lot of focus on prevention and helping young people and funding prevention for families, young families specifically, to get linked to the services they need so that parents aren't feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, and throwing their hands up. I just think that's an important one. And over again in the recommendations, we're really seeing things that talk about better system collaboration, really supporting young families that are in need, funding and support for behavioral health. Again, I think that's a vital part, making sure that our clinicians are willing to go out, but helping us with recruitment too. I think that's a piece that we have to get. Like, we have positions at the court ready to be filled. We don't have applicants, and that's a concern. So while we have, funding, not having applicants is really concerning. So,
You look at the different groups. So we said we need some, like Jennifer said, you got cooperation to get some people. So let's take, for instance, we talking about the Black community. We got the Black ministers. We have never been to them and asked them. I'm not saying us, but I'm just saying, think about it. I deal with them. Nobody has ever came and asked them to help. We got the different fraternities. They do different things all the time. I don't know anybody who's been to them to ask them to help. How do we know what they're going to do? And guess what? Might not cost us any money, because they'll do the resource. If you're talking about mentors, so if you got all these fraternities, all these ministers, we go to explain to them what we need. You talk about jobs. They got parishioners in there, and some of these people are educated, that some of them might be looking for jobs. They might not know. Once again, if they don't know what we need, everybody don't go on Indeed or whatever, some of these job sites. So I'm not saying it's 100% going to work, but I tell you what, if we never tapped into that resource, how do you know it's not going to work? So I think those are resources that we can utilize.
I agree. The court does spend, we have monthly meetings with Cleveland Clergy Coalition, so we do involve them in some discussions. Many of our grassroots agencies are plugged into the community, coming from highly impacted communities. But I think there's sort of a gap sometimes. We have a lot of families dealing with social isolation. We have to be a little bit more creative. A lot of families aren't necessarily, we need people who are going to be willing to help link families to those resources. It's not the same as when I grew up, that not everyone's going to churches. Not everyone, there's a lot of community safety issues that some families that we work with aren't even allowing their kids to go to rec centers, So I think the proliferation of gun availability has in many ways sort of negatively impacted a lot of communities where, kids aren't necessarily as tied into those local resources, recreation centers, churches, things of that nature. So we do need to figure out how to help link families to those things, but that requires a resource that has time to link families to those things.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like, if you've never been in a church and there's a church like around the way, who's helping? Sometimes families need a little bit of a mentor to help them along the way, or a therapist or a PO to say, why don't we just knock on the door? Why don't we call them and see when their services are, when their supports, what they can provide? And I know that requires resources just to even make that linkage.
But let's just
so.
ask the churches to do that. So
Yeah.
like my church, I go to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. We're in the Mount Pleasant thing. We need to step up to the plate a little more.
And that is I just looked at that community specifically when we were looking at data, and there's so much need.
And we got a whole lot of churches there
Yeah.
too. So I'm saying, I'm one of the advisors for the ministers. I know you deal with some different ministries.
Yes.
But they got a lot of different
Yep.
ministerial alliances. I'm saying if we can reach out to it, and we can't put it all on you, it has to be the other ministers reaching out to the ministers to step into them communities and let them know more. You talk about the rec centers. I know they got, go to rec centers now, they got metal detectors when you come in the door. They got officers that's working at the rec centers now. So do the families know that it might be a little more safer? But they still got to get there, But if they live in that community, we might be able to get a safe route for them.
And a way to help them know how those rec centers, those churches can help meet some of their basic need gaps right now. Because as we're looking at, nationally, cuts to food banks and things like that, like, if you can't meet your most basic needs, food insecurity is only going to create more issues in this community. So how can we use or connect families with those resources to say, here are the things that you can get right down the street, and here's how you can safely get there. I think will really
And
help our
we have a food, like
Yeah.
our church, we do hot food meals. We got food pantries that our parishioners donate to, and a lot of people don't know about it. And some of that's, I'm gonna put it, is this recorded, I'll say it, it's some of our churches, we're not doing a good enough job. We need to do a better job. And I promise you, I'm gonna talk to my pastor and our different members and say, we need to step up to the plate a little bit more, because our community is being affected by it.
Well, and I think too, getting you involved in, and a representative from clergy and neighborhood churches and local churches in the work of OJJDP is a big piece. That, we can't just have official system people. We need to get neighborhood community people that are authentically from the communities that are deeply impacted by these issues. So I think when we get moving on our action planning and work with Care First Cuyahoga, that we make sure that we are tapping into our clergy, our supports that are more natural to the environment kids come from.
The other thing is we used to have neighborhood collabs that worked really closely as part of our high fidelity wraparound system. And you had case managers who were connected to a collab in a certain neighborhood and served families in that community. But, that funding has gone away. And now they're sort of different types of wraparound supports, but they're often based on insurance and managing behavioral and physical health care and not managing families in their community. And so as some of those collabs have closed and some of those really neighborhood-focused models have shifted, we've seen families be a little bit more isolated and not know how to get the supports that they need.
And most of the communities also got these CDCs that are around there, different groups, and tap into them. Like I say, we're not gonna be able to solve everything, but the more people you get involved, to me, it seems like the more help that you need, because the juvenile system use it. I mean, just like, I didn't even know about half of these programs until I got on the committee. Not that I didn't care, but I was so busy doing everything else until I never paid any attention and know anything about what's going on. So it's just awareness sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's wrong-headed to be cutting money for violence interrupters, food, CASA, okay, and expect that the problem's gonna get better. But I'm having a moment because it feels as though we've done an excellent job of identifying the problem, not so much as it relates to the direction for the solution. And that still brings me back to what you guys were saying on the front end here about the organization of this report. I think we can at least start to try to figure out what that's going to look like. Again, from my perspective, there are broad trends that are contained in these recommendations that we ought to be able to pull out. And maybe that's the thing that we should be doing at this juncture. You guys have mentioned them. We probably now need to put them down on paper. So prevention was one. Community collaboration was a second one. County involvement in standing up resources within specific communities or parts of the community that we have already identified as being the hotbeds of gun violence would seem to be a third one. Making money available to the court for the purpose of increasing its ability to service young people where they find them. Specifically, I'm thinking about filling those 15 vacancies that you have as it relates to probation officers. Those are just things off the top of my head.
So, and the other thing, we talk about money, opportunity. There are job and vocational programming supports and educational supports out there. I think when the many partners have shared that young people have talked about wanting opportunities for job, they just don't know how to get tapped into that, so kids in communities where there's lots of resources can just walk down the street, go get a job with ease. I think helping young people, or their parents are highly connected and know a lot of people, things like that. It's easy to get those kids into internship. It's easy to get those kids into vocational. Their parents are identifying it and their teachers are identifying, this kid probably is more geared towards vocational expertise, which some of those programs that we have lots of industry in Cleveland, and they have a need for young people. So I know when the Youth Justice Collective shared, they talked about young people repeatedly saying employment and job opportunities. And when I was out at a community, I had somebody come up to me about why are we not doing more for young people to get into trades and specialized training that we can employ from, within our own neighborhoods, things like that? So opportunities for young people will definitely provide a protective factor, especially when we're talking about most of the kids that we're serving are of the age where they can be hired at local companies and are short from graduating from high school or getting their GED and actually can have a skill. I think it's important that we give them skills that can sustain them for a long time. We think about young people who are likely to recidivate. We're talking about people without opportunity, without hope, without a path forward. So I think they're, getting probation officer caseload sizes down can help tap into those resources. Those community collabs are still happening. I just don't know if they're as well-funded as they used to be. And I think they're probably inundated with, a focus on problems, but if we can tap into the potential on some of those, that would require the resources for us to be able to link families and walk them through things. So I agree with your recommendations. I just wanted to add that about education and opportunities for young people. If you don't see a way forward, you're more likely to stay doing the thing that you just know and that feels comfortable and feels safe and as unsafe as it may be. If that's what you know and that puts money in your pocket today, you're likely to continue to engage in that until it's no longer an option due to incarceration or something worse. So, if we give these young people opportunities, I think that would be important. And those programs are out there. We just have to figure out how to link kids to those and continue to fund them.
So I got a question about that. Is there a way, like the list of jobs that you say are available, or any of the programs that you need some additional help? Is there a way I can get a list of that? I know this is outside of our realm. I'm willing to. I'll go to the ministers. I'll go to the fraternities. I'll go to the sororities. I'll go to a bunch of other organizations that I deal with all the time. I'll make that commitment. I'll do it myself. I just need the information, and I'm gonna reach back out, like I say, to CASA, because if them two groups got together, they needed areas. The city they're involved in this as a community partner too, because the city got to deal with these issues. So if who would I get that list from?
So we can start, but there's plenty of other people that have information and knowledge. Like Jen said, sometimes what her system knows, mine does not, and what child welfare
And that's what's
knows,
happening, right?
yeah.
If I could just get a list, like I say, I'll make that commitment today that I would get this information to every last one of them groups. I know all the leaders of them. I'll go to them personally myself and talk to them and tell them, here's some things we need. Is it gonna fill everything? Probably not, but you never know what we can get out of it by going to them. And Jennifer, I like what you said. Some people just don't know. And I just want to try to help get that information out and see what we can get.
And I appreciate that, Marvin, but at the same time and by the same token, you're only one person. Okay, and I really think that this goes back to what we were saying before, that the county, and now I'm talking about the county writ large, by way of the county executive and the county council, need to make this a priority, and that priority needs to be to organize all of the things that you're talking. It's one thing for you to go to these folks and you got a personal relationship with them, and that's fine. It's a whole nother level, I think, for the county to come to them and say, listen, we need for you to come to the table. We have resources that we have gleaned from across the county that we can not only make available to you, but coordinate to put you in partnership with in order to move the dial. Because us individually, us as a committee, we can only move the dial a little. I think the whole point of putting us together in the first instance was to figure out how the county can move the dial a lot. Okay.
Yeah, I think, a centralized, like, intake, if you will, a place where families can go and call and somebody helps support that. One of the reasons why we've found success with the Early Intervention and Diversion Center is we do a warm handoff. We're not handing a parent a list of phone numbers and being like, go down the list, hope someone takes your call, hope someone takes your insurance, hope someone calls you back, right? Before they walk out the door, the person who they're meeting with has already connected them to the service, made the calls for them, makes the follow-up calls to make sure they're going to those appointments and that barriers are removed, whether it's for job skills, educational training, credit recovery, therapy, whatever it is. I think that human contact, that person who can help organize for families that are already living with so much chaos, just trying to manage their own household, is really what we need to make sure there's the follow-through. Because if I hand a parent a list of, like, call all these places, or a kid, right, they give up, or they don't get a call back, or it's never mind, you didn't do this, or, oh, you have a charge, I can't take you. We need someone to help guide them through it. And so sort of like a central, I don't know, navigation or some type of bridge, somebody to help connect the families with however many systems they need to be connected with is what we're kind of missing.
Well, one of the things that we were able to do in another part of the system while I was still on the bench was we organized Family Justice Center for victims of crime. Okay, and what you're saying sounds a whole lot like the same kind of a mechanism that is a one-stop shop where you can go in, be assessed. It can be determined, what your needs are, and then all of the systems come to you rather than you go to the systems. And you were talking about centralized intake, and I'm curious as to where does that happen currently?
Yeah, I mean, and so this is a concept that isn't really new to conversations, but it's an important one, is, we developed the Early Intervention Diversion Center years back because the front door of the court was, sort of riddled with concerns regarding different kids who come from different communities getting different level of services. So we really tried to sort of, for some kids, elevate, opportunities for them where those weren't easily accessible in their communities. So,
And this is early intervention.
yeah, in diversion center for a kid. So they have to have either an unruly or a truancy filing, which are definitely flags of concerns for a young person if their family's saying they're running away from home, or if their school's saying they're not showing up to school. Those are huge indicators that that kid is on a path that we need to, sort of course correct with supports and services. So that's one way. The other way is through arrest from law enforcement. So if they have a delinquency matter. When we were trying to do this and get this off the ground, we were working with a previous director at Division of Children and Family Services. We were going to jurisdictions that had child welfare people embedded in the system. I think is really important. If we have a law enforcement official arresting a young person who's fighting in their home, and the answer is call police, I think that's where we have first thought wrong, right? So if the police came to my house every time one of the 5 Gibbons kids were throwing something across the room to each other, we'd have the police at my house every single day, right? So this is normal teenage sibling behaviors. But when you have a family who is dealing with poverty, trauma, and other complicated factors, that it becomes an answer for them. So what I think we need to do is think about how child welfare, behavioral health, Board of Developmental Disabilities, and juvenile court, and other community-based natural resources can intervene and help families versus bring them further into the youth justice system.
Does the Early Intervention and Diversion Center coordinate like that?
It tries to, but it's very court-driven. We have contract with Applewood clinicians. The court just through reclaim funding, because this was a huge issue. Kids that were failing out of school because of developmental disabilities, or they have autism spectrum disorder and they're fighting in their homes, are coming to the attention of the court, and families are getting identified. So we now have a court liaison with DD that is just coming on board. So we have them there. We have juvenile court. We have Applewood centers. And Applewood does not just refer to Applewood. Applewood refers to every service under the sun. We have a missing component. We don't have child welfare embedded in that, and we don't have any other, any other youth serving system embedded in that. So I think there's an opportunity to think better about, instead of youth justice being the only way to get into that, figuring out more how to resource that. And that is really a recommendation that we would have, is we fund that through Reclaim. But if we looked at pooling resources for child welfare, Adams Board through mental health, behavioral health partners, DD, other youth serving systems, and really pushed out services to those highly impacted communities and supporting young people, I think we could get a lot further than just constantly expecting juvenile court to be the end-all, be-all answer to issues that were bubbling up for a long time. By the time they get to our doors, the wheels are already coming off for families. So I think thinking about that Hennepin model or moving things way further up for service coordination and prevention efforts would go a long way for our community.
Do we have did your trip to Hennepin County give you kind of the model itself? Or?
Yeah, there were a lot of recommendations, and it is about identifying kids at, earlier up in the child welfare system that are showing signs that are disrupting from schools, prevention teams that are, again, though we're going into a challenge area, they're relying on social workers that are wanting to do community-based work, not social workers wanting to be at home in their jammies, cozy, doing online work. And I think there is a need for that type of clinician, but it's not the service. That's not the clinicians that we need. That's not the social workers we need. We need those that are willing to be in the community. So are we paying our people, our behavioral health clinicians, doing the hard work in the community in the same way that clinicians working on a Zoom account are getting paid? And so, yeah, I think they have a lot of prevention efforts upstream with specialized teams that think about helping wrap around families versus waiting for systems to fight over who's responsible for payment of services.
Right now, to access early intervention and diversion, you're coming in with unruly or misdemeanor charge. So being able to go further up to the prevention end of, hey, I'm starting to feel stressed, or I'm starting to see my kid do this, without actually having to go through the court system at all, would be a better way to catch more kids sooner.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, again, we're talking about, this stuff falls into that prevention bucket. And I think I'm moving towards trying to identify some actually specific concrete things that anybody who takes a look at the recommendations can say, okay, well, that's doable. This thing with regard to Hennepin County, to the degree that it's proven successful, ought to be, I think, one of the things that we say, this is something that we're not saying we think, we know can work, and has been vetted already by the juvenile court. This thing with regard to centralized intake and early intervention and diversion center needs funds. It's on the front end.
Right.
And we've already established that it can work. It's just not been brought up to the level where it's as optimum.
And I don't think that we should be tasked with laying out the nitty-gritty granular details of that. I think our recommendation should really just be about better service coordination, early prevention support that is countywide, that really keeps kids out of the youth justice system. And a detail on the end of that recommendation could be additionally supporting whatever program development comes from and recommendations from OJJDP, Care First Cuyahoga. So like that can be a recommendation. prevention support that is cross-system and engages natural grassroots community providers also. So, because oftentimes we've left them out of the rooms and off the table. So to Marvin's point about, there's resource specialists or family navigators or family support specialists that we can help. I think that, to Jen's point, I think that kind of checks all the boxes, and I would be happy to attempt to bucket that into one sentence that captures that, and we can talk about a financial recommendation for that. So I think that could be recommendation number one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I always think that when you're talking about things kind of in a broad way, that you need to be able to have something that folks can focus on. They don't necessarily have to adopt it,
Yeah.
but you can say, this is an example of what we're talking about that we know
Yeah.
works. This is something that we are working on now, currently, that has apparently worked, but at a suboptimal level because of the way that it's funded. We should do that. I mean, the broad statement I think is good, but I think that there ought to be
We
some
can point to successful jurisdictions on that, so,
successful
okay,
jurisdictions. Yeah.
got it.
Okay.
And that could be recommendation number one.
That could be.
It feels like
And
it's the most upstream, the most important one that we can talk about.
And I think that our charge here really ought to focus a lot on what can be done upstream.
Yeah.
What can we do to keep people from ever having to see the inside of the juvenile court? I mean, from the county's perspective, because I mean, the fewer people that actually have to come and visit with the judges at the court, the better this community is going to be.
Maybe that's the way that we make our recommendations. So lightest touch, most earliest prevention all right, so our last recommendation is going to be for those kids that enter the youth justice system and have to be, taken into account because they're violating and jeopardizing community safety. These are the findings and recommendations we make for those.
I like that.
Definitely want to keep them out of the system.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, nothing ever good comes from anybody who has to have contact with the justice system from the criminal standpoint.
People are not generally clicking their heels to come into a court.
No.
Yeah,
No.
so,
No matter how you slice it. So,
yeah.
and again, that's always a harder sell because a lot of folks just think, well, if they committed a crime, they should be punished. But you got to look at what the research suggests, which is punishment doesn't equate to behavior modification all the time.
So then we talked a little bit about, really targeting, so for prevention that is in the spirit of our first recommendation. Then we're talking about, things that drive young people into the youth justice system. So the other common theme that came up was really about resources and supports to those communities that are highly impacted and utilizing data to follow those specific communities in need. Is that something that county resources, we can make recommendations for county resources? And what do you guys think is the first place to look at that on? Like that level of thinking about why certain areas have a high level of involvement with the youth justice system. How do we help stand up some services and supports in those communities? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first response that I have as it relates to that comment is yes. Okay, because I think that it flows naturally to go from prevention to putting things in place in the community that kind of support prevention. And those would be making things available, such as more resources for rec centers or other things that have to do with occupational enhancement. Again, it goes back to this keeps people out of the system, period.
And Judge, just like, once again, I'm not saying I know the answer, but information getting out to the correct people, like even in our church, we had a youth paint program where they could come and enroll and learn how to paint, which entails jobs because they actually had somebody that was gonna employ some of the people who finished the program. So right there provided employment. So I think we need to step it up a little more. When I say we, I'm talking about the community. Some of these community groups could, if they know about this, I think they might be able to help.
So, and that part is about standing up supports for young kids that are at risk of involvement in the youth justice system, getting them linked to those job readiness and out of school time, pro-social activities. You know, I think about young people who have a trade that's, you know, can sustain them for a lifetime and provide health insurance for them and their families, you know. We had a kid coming out of DYS who wanted to be a welder. He wanted to learn how to weld, and there were people around the table saying, well, let's get him a job at Amazon. I'm like, he just said he wants to be a welder. Like, what are they doing at Amazon that they're welding, you know? So why don't we follow that? And our felony youth specialist actually got Tri-C Manufacturing to come in, get this kid enrolled. In our detention center, we have kids that attend Tri-C, but families don't know how to do the financial aid enrollment, things like that. Like, there's things that when you are from a home where there's been generations of college attendance or you are connected to a trade union, people know how to do with these. If you've ever done the work in reentry, which I used to do back in the day, these kids didn't have anyone who was in a trade. They did not know where to get specialized technical skills in trade. So it was, come on, get in the car, let's go here, let's do this, let's go shake hands, let's go meet people that are at that union you're interested in and ask them how they did it. I have a friend who's we had a young person who was deeply involved in the justice system. We got him into a program where he was surrounded by a nerve DJ, surrounded by really great adults. Kid learned some skills, but you know, he doesn't want to DJ for the rest of his life, but it helped him get out of the trouble he was in by safe adults. And he wants to be an EMT. I have a friend who's EMT. We made the connection. He coached him, talked to him through, like, here's how I did it and here's what you need to do. And this is where we really need to bring resources in. And I think that recommendation on number 2 with standing up community supports with pro-social, job readiness, education, requires a bit more than just resources. It requires the human touch to help navigate these kids through it. So I think mentors are key to that. And I don't think we should be having to pay every mentor, right? So I don't think we will ever have the resources. We need some volunteer mentors that are willing to say, you've got a job interview tomorrow at 8:30. Have you laid out your outfit? You know, those are really things that are tangible that we need to also stand up in this process.
Hey Bridget, so one of the things that, why I be kind of passionate about it, I grew up on 149th and Kinsman, 97th St. Clair, and 93rd and Wilton because my family we didn't have a lot. My parents, I love them, but I'm just being honest, my parents never really taught me a whole lot, except go to school and graduate. That was their thing. I got to graduate from high school. But I learned most of my things from being associated with Woodland Recreation Center, which is on 93rd and Woodland. The center director made me learn how to swim. I hated swimming. I was the worst swimmer. Plus, I'm a sinker. I'm the kind of guy I can get in the pool and just sit right at the bottom.
Me too.
You know, so they're called sinkers. Yeah, I was a sinker.
Me too.
But I took life guard training.
Yep.
And then he forced me to take WSI, which is water safety instructor. Well, then I end up helped me get a summer job at the pools. And then I end up got full-time job as a recreation physical director.
And that's a sense of, that's like check That's
Yeah.
like vital to adolescent development, right?
Yeah.
So checking a box that those people did at the rec center for you was a sense of purpose and identity. You had some structure and routine. Those are things that I think this recommendation is warranted.
Right,
It's
I do
based
too.
on the importance of building up protective factors, it's opportunities, and it's helping young people. You know, identity is a huge piece. So if you're those fence sitters, sometimes those kids that are sitting on the fence and you could be pushed easily one way or another, we have to figure out how to push them into opportunities, or they're gonna find opportunities.
And I live there. That's why I say I know this.
Know it,
I
right.
know that if I hadn't had that help, and like I said, I'm not saying my parents, they love me and they're good parents, but they were just limited in their ability. I mean, I'm just being real. I played basketball, high school and college. My parents never came to one game. That don't mean they didn't love me, but that wasn't them. They was like, finish high school and you doing good. So I was able to finish high school, and God bless me, I was able to finish college because I played basketball. Now, I was so far down the bench, you took a megaphone to call me to get in the game, but guess what? I got my degree because of that. So I do speeches around to different places to tell these young people, you can still make it. You know, you talking about the NBA. Everybody wants to be an NBA player. Well, guess what? I literally myself, I did 14 years in the NBA. I didn't shoot not one shot except on the sideline, but I was the director of security. They got videography jobs. They got all types of jobs that if you're not exposed to it, how do you know to go get it?
Well, and I think right now, one of the things we're hearing from our kids is with all the gun violence, I don't feel safe walking down the street to get there. I don't feel safe, and families don't have transportation, which why for me, I think I kind of keep coming back to that transportation piece because that's a real barrier to our kids being able to get those supports. We run after-school programs at a couple of the behavioral health agencies, and we can only bring as many kids in as we have spaces on a minivan to get them there, right? We're going to the schools, we're picking them up, we're driving them home. Like that's a real challenge for our kids right now. We have high school kids saying, I got to school safely. There's no busing, I got here. That was the victory of the day. Like, I'm physically here, and I didn't get shot at on the way, attacked on the way, I'm safe. And I think for our kids, that's a place that we really need to look at trying to remove barriers. The other thing when you're talking about job training, I've been doing this for over 25 years and only recently learned about Cleveland Builds, which is an apprenticeship readiness program to help connect young adults to union trades and union jobs. And we've had some really great conversations with them around some of our high-end kids and kids that have had some court involvement, and how do we help those kids get these very well-paying, stable jobs with benefits that will help take care of their families. And so they would be a good resource to bring to the table, too.
So you're talking about barrier removal, and I think that we ought to put that in as one of the areas that the county can focus on.
I mean, they did that with healthcare, right? They went to get mobile vans to come do dental and medical in some of the schools so that families could get there. Some way to remove that access barrier.
So second category is around the spirit of barrier removal, or a strength-based way to put that is like building resiliency or something like that, So
Yeah.
figuring out how do we take the unmet needs and really target those into the areas of most need, right? So really, we're not going to be able to we're not going to fix every societal woe, right? But we can really look at where our kids are showing up heavily from and begin to think about those communities. And what was talked about was job readiness, mentors, building up natural supports for young people, and pro-social activities. And then, so that's like, we talked prevention, now we're talking building resiliency or barrier removals. And then I think the next recommendation should be, so if they get into the youth justice system, what improvements do we need to make in recommending getting kids out faster, less penetration into deeper justice involvement, such as detention, DYS, or out-of-home placements?
And so I have some even on that one. So just what you said about somebody getting into the detentions, in the justice system, juvenile justice system, having the right people, somebody to mentor them and talk to them. So just actually do that in my church, that we had a couple people that have did some things that got into the system, and they were able to come and we sat down with them and talked to them about where they went wrong, what are some of the things that you could do to try to rectify it. And they would actually listen to someone who come from where they come from. Now, that don't mean they all gonna do it, but at least if you're not gonna save the nation, but if we could save a few,
Yeah.
and that passes on to save another few, I think that's a success. And I coach too, you know, and I hate to cut players, but some guys have bad attitudes, and I'm not gonna let one bad apple ruin the whole bunch. I'll cut them. And I'll tell them, and then I'll call their parents. Some of the parents don't care when you call them, but I'll still call them and tell them, you know, but if we don't try, that's my thing, we gotta try. And you can't keep doing the same thing or you're gonna get the same results. That's just my opinion.
So in the building resiliency, I think, Marvin, you're talking about really mentors, credible messengers, you know, people who've had that. Restorative justice is something, you know, right now we have the funding for a small number of kids to benefit from. This is a place where I would say the appropriate recommendation was smaller caseload size for POs so that we can really monitor young people, more important than monitoring is building good relationships with young people and being able to specifically put a case plan in that meets the needs that are driving the kid into the youth justice system. So I think if we're going to do that justice system improvements, that can be like where we put those recommendations, specifically mentors, credible messengers, restorative justice, and lower caseload sizes by increasing the number of probation officers we have. This also feels like a place where we can speak to recommendations for incentivizing behavioral health clinicians, recruitment. I don't know, Jen, do you and I need to start really supporting our clinicians, going into classrooms, talking to graduate students, things of that nature we need to really start thinking about. I know City of Cleveland did a lot of work around this stuff. How do we lift up some of those recommendations too? And then I think this is the place too where, you know, if a young person does have to be removed from the home, and sometimes those are issues of abuse, neglect, overwhelmed caregivers, you know, time for us to get a service coordination team together, that respite bed and those therapeutic alternative to detention options can come in. I think we've made such strides in this area where the only young people that are being removed from the home really, truly are in a case where they don't have a safe place to go. And the detention center should never, ever be the option for that issue. So we have a young man in there today. He is a very expensive young man. We have to have a detention officer around the clock for that young person, for every waking hour with that young person, because his behavioral health, mental health needs are so significant. No place is willing to take this young man. And it creates a lot of issues of violence, and really teaching our detention officers the skills to navigate, he's starting to go. How do we de-escalate? How do we help prevent? How do we remove the stimuli? That's a lot of work and it's very expensive, but that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. More specialized supports and alternatives would be helpful. So the justice system improvements, we kind of rattled those off a little bit. And I think that could be, residential beds too, to support those young people.
On the back end, do you want to look at reentry supports? Helping kids as they're coming back into the community be wrapped around?
So what is that final stage? Reentry supports and other recommendations that kind of fell into that?
The reentry will fall back again into some help from the different community groups. And it don't cost I mean, because most of the groups will, I mean, if somebody have some funding for them, but if I'm talking to mentoring somebody, I'm not expecting to be paid, just like you said, Bridget. Every volunteer can't be paid. So if they're gonna volunteer from their heart, you're not gonna have to pay them.
Well, the county has an office of reentry, but that's for adults, I think.
Yeah, and they do partner with us, but again, I think that historically it has been very geared towards adults. So we are engaging them in work on the youth justice side too.
But I think full circle, part of the reentry process could be bridging them back to our one-stop shop where we have for all the things. Okay, well, here's how you get job support, here's how you get housing support, here's how you know, that's.
And I'll say, the key part here, violence interruption, credible messengers have to be a part of this too, Many of the kids that are coming from ODYS are coming back to sometimes unstable housing situations, lack of job stability, the same situation that, they got in there in the first place. So, getting people that really know how to quell violence and settle things, I think would be an important part. And I know City of Cleveland's doing a lot of work around this. I just think this is an opportunity for county and city to do some collaborative efforts, because you're gonna, we do have a lot of tragic loss. And then, when we talk about young people experiencing trauma, if we're not addressing the root causes of the trauma, if we're not addressing trauma, there's going to continue to be, sort of trauma reactive violence, things of that nature. So I think that'd be a place where we can really think about whether it's restorative practices, sort of reentry planning, or violence interrupters. We're thinking about again, some of these are going to be overlapping recommendations that can fill a couple buckets, but educational opportunities, not waiting for the kid to go back into the community and say, now what do we do with you? But that is beginning to happen at a much earlier point, and kids are linked as soon as they come out. They've got a plan in place. So I will say this is a place that, the court oftentimes historically has relied on state parole, but the court is now getting far more involved in designing around reentry planning. And so I think this is going to be a place we're going to think about those young people.
One of the areas that I know that came up in some of the presenters was East Cleveland. You know how bad they're hurting. But right now, so East Cleveland just opened back up that rec center, which is, that's huge for them, because they had no place to go. And like I said, I coach at Shaw. And sometimes we tell them kids, all right, you got to go home because the varsity is getting ready to practice or something. And you got all these kids hanging around. I'm like, well, why don't you go home? They don't want to go home. They don't want to go home. And they had no alternative place to go but out there in the streets. And then when they get out in the streets, they get into things. So them open that rec center, man, I think that's gonna be dynamite for them. It's not gonna solve everything, but every little bit helps.
And I know Catalyzed Justice also incorporated in their recommendations for reentry as job opportunities. So I think we spoke to that in the other one, but I think we can kind of just, have that in there.
Okay, well, it's a lot of good stuff. I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. As far as, but I'm starting to see, beginnings of a formation. So we've kind of identified some major areas, and into which I think we can plug recommendations that have already been made. And then we can kind of homogenize that and see if that'll work. Yeah.
It's not recommendations.
Yeah, like I said, my biggest concern is that this is such a target-rich environment. probably a bad analogy to me, but it's such an environment that provides us with so many different in the candy store kind of options that it's entirely possible for folks to just say and not want to do it. But I really think that the list that you guys have just put together suggests some concrete, doable things that folks can focus on. Nobody is suggesting that everything that we put in front of them is something that they're going to do, but it may be one of those kind of things where it's one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, and ultimately we move the dial. And since we're not going to solve the problem, from my perspective, the thing that I think that we are really charged with doing is trying to figure out for the county what are the things that they can do to help the juvenile court move the dial.
Then can I just ask, so then once we make the recommendations that I think are programmatic, you know, if we want to really talk about sort of shifting other recommendations that are sort of outside of like prevention, intervention, reentry kind of things, you know, as a county thinking about youth justice, does the committee want to make some recommendations on really how we frame as a community, as a county, how we talk about young people who come into contact with the youth
Absolutely.
justice system? I think we've got to start thinking about the potential for young people, supporting them versus demonizing them. And I think that should be something that we speak to, because it does not make a community safer when we are framing young people as the most dangerous things in our community, when the reality is the data doesn't show that. You know, the bulk of violence that happens in the community is at the hands of people over the age of 18. And by focusing sort of disproportionately on young people, it doesn't really get us dug into solutions. It just sort of isolates, demonizes them. And I think it's important for, as the adults in our community, to think about rehabilitation and support for young people and healing young people and getting them the services they need. I think that's an important recommendation, is for the adults in this county, in this community, we need to think about being the adults.
Yeah.
In my house, I'm not afraid of my kids, you know? So like, we have to think about how we model adult and how we talk as adults for young people and support them, and versus demonizing them. So I think I'd really like that we add that as just a general, as a county, how we want to go forth and think about problem-solving issues with young people versus demonizing them.
Hey, Judge.
Judge, do you,
I'm
sorry, I
sorry.
was going to
No,
make a
you go ahead.
suggestion.
Yeah.
As far as organization, as I'm listening, I think it could be helpful to frame out our thoughts as a finding and then a recommendation with under it, it could have action items as well as then aspirations. So right now, I think we've been talking about, as you just mentioned, what is a major takeaway? So major takeaway would be that violence is, even though it's portrayed as amongst youth, that the statistics show otherwise. And then under that, there would be a recommendation, and I've made out some buckets based on this conversation that I can send out to everyone, and we could frame those into recommendations, and then underneath them, they could have that more granular detail, but there would be a major recommendation, a broad one, and then underneath it could have specific, you know, suggestions, action items, and then, as you mentioned, like aspirations, that youth will be seen as, you know, productive members of our society, and bettering the region's, you know, future, something along those lines.
So Laura and I have been talking about this over the course of last week, the need for us, in addition to having recommendations, you know, putting together some findings. And I think that the suggestion that you're making, Laura, makes all kinds of sense. I think it just naturally flows from, you know, findings to recommendations, you know, and yeah, so if you can do that for us, that would be great.
Judge, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Would it be appropriate, once we refine our, whatever we're gonna do, and we present it to the county council, would it be appropriate to do like a news conference on what we done? to, do we have to get approval for that? Because to let the community know, you can get the news agencies to come, and that word would get out even more, because they'll see what some of our recommendations are. I don't know if that's appropriate or not.
I don't know that it's inappropriate, but let's think about that, you know, because publicizing whatever it is that we do, I think is vitally important. How we go about publicizing it is another thing altogether. I don't want to engage in a one-day wonder, you know, that gets us, you know, a minute and a half at 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock news on one station, you know.
I wasn't talking about one station.
Well,
around where the news media follow.
when you set up a news conference, you don't know who's going to show up, okay? It all depends on what's happening on the news cycle on that particular day. So you just don't know. That's why I said, you know.
I just asked.
No, I'm not saying that it's a bad idea. I'm just saying we need to give some thought as to what is the best way to publicize what we've accomplished in a way that causes people to actually buy into it and come to the conclusion that these are things that need to be done. And then that may be one way. There may be some other ways that are effective with regard to our target audience, whatever that target audience should be, because it's going to be the general community on one hand, but it's going to be all the service providers on the other hand. It's going to be the staff at the court. We've got multiple audiences that I think that we need to be putting this in the hands of, and we want to put it in the hands of them in a way that causes them to say, yeah, I can do that. All right. Okay. I'm trying to think, is there anything that... Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's kind of where we're at. Just need to kind of figure out how to do the work. This is, you know, I know this is a dead run to the border at this point, because we're talking about, this is May 1st. We got to get this done by the 31st. I am forever grateful to both Laura and Janine to keep me kind of on track. I want to thank you guys for everything that you've done, you know, by way of your input. We probably, I know I've got to be out of town next Thursday through Sunday, but outside of that, I'm around. I think that it's probably important if you guys can find some time, even if, I started to say, even if we could do it on Zoom, not Zoom, or teleconference, but I guess that's not possible because we got public. Yeah, that's terrible. I can't stand it. And those are the days that we vetted to determine. But we can send out stuff in the interim period so that it's probably going to be a stream of consciousness kind of thing between now and the 23rd.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spoken pretty publicly about the direction that we're going to go with this and how we came to these findings. I think the work between now and the 23rd can really be dealt with just making these recommendations, putting them in the report, making it succinct. And I like what Laura recommended, and I think we can take that framework to make our recommendations. I know my schedule's freed up a little bit, so my major deadline is, well, slightly behind me, but I've got one more thing to do on that project, so I think we'll be able to allocate the time to this and get a good recommendations done in the time frame we need to.
Okay. Did you get a chance to take a look at the current state of affairs with regard to the? Yes. The fire? Are you okay with it? Okay. Changes will be made. Yes. Okay. And any suggestions that you have as it relates to changes? There's no pride of authorship going on here. So any change that you come up with that you think needs to be made, send it around to everybody. Let's we can debate it, and then we can see where we are. Because when we come together on the 23rd, we really should be talking about nailing down the final to the degree that that's possible.
And I'll make a quick thing that you are welcome to add comments throughout that document as well on the shared drive, and we can always incorporate them that way.
Okay. Is there anything else for the good of the order, or this is a good place to stop? Marv? Okay. Okay. Is there any miscellaneous business that needs to be considered? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second it.
Properly moved and seconded that we adjourn this meeting of the Juvenile Court Advisory Subcommittee until May the 23rd. We'll be back. It's the same bad time, same bad channel, right? Okay.
Thank you.
We're off and running. Thank you.